So good evening and welcome everyone. I'm Chavati Rose Samuelson. I'm the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at ASU. I'm also a Regents Professor of History, and I'm Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism. To those of you who are not familiar with the Center for Jewish Studies, let me say that we are a hybrid of an academic program and a research center. We serve as an intellectual resource for all aspects and all dimensions of the Jewish experience. We offer undergraduate and graduate courses, research conferences, public lectures, webinars, and historical exhibits. So Jewish Studies at ASU fosters critical inquiry about the past, as well as an invitation to engage in the study of the present. We believe that knowledge about Jewish culture is critical for flourishing Jewish life in the 21st century and to constructive relations between Jews and non-Jews in everything that we do. Our programs contribute to the quality of Jewish life in metropolitan Phoenix, and they enhance Jewish studies around the world. Now, COVID-19, as we all know, forced us all to do things via Zoom. But we had actually a very successful year. Our last year, which was all Zoom events, was quite successful, very good reception of our programs and a very high number of participants. And we intend to continue in that mode during this semester. Next semester, we'll also have one or two major public events in person, but most of it will remain also via Zoom. So we are starting our programs this year with this lecture this evening. And the focus of this lecture and the lecture next week will be on religion and science. So you may want to ask, why are we doing such a program? Why are we focusing on religion and science? And I would say two major points I would like to suggest by way of answering the question. First, I think that the focus on the relationship between Judaism and science is one theme that makes what we do at ASU in the Jewish Studies at ASU quite unique. To those of you who don't know, the Center for Jewish Studies is actually the home of an organization called Judaism, Science, and Medicine Group, or the acronym of JSMG. And this organization is an international society. It was founded in 2008, and it now has about 250 members worldwide. And we do, the main activity of the organization is an annual conference. For example, the last conference, which was done on Zoom, of course, was at February 28th. And it was, the focus of the conference was Judaism and climate change. And our next conference, as you can imagine, is going to focus on Judaism and pandemics. So that's scheduled for March 27, 2022. So in other words, JSMG is a very important activity or engagement of the Center for Jewish Studies. And what's unique about the organization is that we host, or it includes Judaica scholars, scientists, physicians, health professionals, rabbis, and educators. And we enable all of these people to talk to each other and to really focus on what Judaism can contribute to the sciences and how scientific knowledge can inform the practice of Judaism. So that's the first reason why we should spend some time thinking about Judaism and science, or religion and science more generally. The second reason is that the focus on religion and science, or the interest in the relationship between religion and science, is very important to various units at ASU. There are a good number of people who are engaged in this inquiry. I happen to be involved in many of those activities at ASU. And what's unique about those activities is they combine the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. And the people who are involved in these conversations and research are convinced that we need to move beyond the perception that religion and science are in conflict with each other, and instead really understand how they inform each other, both historically as well as conceptually, and how you cannot have a society. I can generalize and say you cannot have a society or a culture in which religion and culture both are going to be present. All societies have it. It's not one or the other. It's always both. So that's why we need to pay attention to their relationship. And we're going to start doing it tonight with Professor Adam Cohen, who is one of the stellar scholars at ASU, among the people who study the relationship between science and religion. So Professor Cohen is a professor of psychology at ASU, and he specializes in social psychology. He came to ASU in 2006, and his research interests cover, or their fuse, cultural, social, and personality psychology. He's interested in how religious differences function as social differences and how they affect all domains of life, or many domains of life, including religious identity and motivation, the whole spectrum of things we call well-being, moral judgments, forgiveness. If you look at any of those themes, you can see that religion is involved in them. Now, Professor Cohen is also interested in applying evolutionary theory to religion to explain religious behavior and religious institutions. And I should mention that this topic will be discussed next week, October 12th, in the second lecture of this series. Now, Professor Cohen is a very productive scholar and a very much decorated academic. His publications include the two books, as far as I could see. First, he's the editor of Culture Reexamined, Broadening Our Understanding of Social and Evolutionary Influences, that came out in 2014. And he's also the co-author of another book under a very interesting title, Generating Generosity, the Role of Religious Beliefs and Institutions in Catholicism and Islam. And I'm not sure whether this book is out. Adam, is it out already?
It's out, yeah.
Oh, good, because
you can find it on Amazon and put it in the chat.
Wonderful. The CV that I got had it still as forthcoming, but I'm glad it's out. Now, in addition to those two books, he also published, and that's what matters most in the discipline of psychology, about 70 peer-reviewed essays in social psychology, psychology of religion, and religion and science. So his essays cover religion and well-being, religion and management. These are some of the topics that you can glean if you see his entire CV. Cross-cultural studies of generosity, religion and consumer behavior, and religion and class differences, and religion and authoritarianism. So you can see that as a social scientist, he deals with issues which are of great concern to all of us, but he brings to this analysis quantitative tools of psychology as a social science, as well as the awareness that religion is a social phenomenon. And it pertains not only to what we believe, what we feel, or what we imagine, but also how we behave, especially toward other people and especially in social institutions. Now, in the social sciences, academic excellence is measured by grants, and Professor Cohen has secured many, many grants to facilitate his research. He's the recipient of grants from the Notre Dame Science of Generosity program, from the Templeton Foundation. That, by the way, to those who don't know, that's a major body in the United States and actually all over the world that covers research on religion and science. He also received a grant from the National Science Foundation, from the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, and from Army Research Institute. And finally, he's also a recipient of fellowship and has served as a fellow. So he received the Margaret Gorman Award from American Psychological Association in 2009, the Godin Prize winner from the International Association for the Psychology of Religion, that's in 2013, and another award an internal award from the Department of Psychology here at ASU. He's a fellow of the Artists Institute, I don't know much about that institute, so maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that in the Q&A segment of this event. And he's a fellow of the Society of Personality and Social Psychology. Tonight, he's going to speak to us about religion and trust. So we're going to hear, I gather, how there are, what's the correlationship between, or relationship between those two concepts, how we measure trust. That would be an interesting thing. Why trust matters in social institutions, especially in religious institutions, and of course, how different religions relate or understand trust differently. So I will now turn off my camera and I will mute myself, and the stage is all yours, Professor Adam Cohen, please.
Well, thank you for that really detailed and generous introduction. It actually anticipates and covers a lot of the points that I want to make tonight about my background and the way that it relates to my research program. The one thing I'm surprised about, I have participated in panels like this before, but never as a presenter. And I thought I'd be able to see people's faces, but I can't. And so if people have questions, I guess what's the best way to handle that? I don't mind if we
the best question to pose questions, the best way to pose questions is to put them in the chat.
Okay.
Or Lisa, either the chat or the Q&A function. Which one do you prefer?
Let's keep them in the Q&A function if people don't mind. Adam, can you see the Q&A?
I have the chat window open. Is that different?
Yeah,
it's
it's
at
a
the
different
bottom.
one.
Oh, that's different. Oh, I see Q&A.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I see Q&A. Okay.
Okay, so everyone, you should see Q&A on the bottom of your screen.
Mm-hmm.
You can click that and you should be able to type questions there.
Okay, perfect. And I'll try to, I'll monitor that, or you'll monitor that as well?
We'll wait until the end and then we'll head into the Q&A.
Okay, well then let me share my slides. Perfect. And then slideshow. How did we do that before? Okay, great. So tonight the topic is going to be religion and trust, as Dr. Tirosh Samuelson said. And as you also mentioned, Chava, I'm a faculty member in psychology and also affiliated with Jewish Studies here at ASU. And this is my favorite book cover because it's so colorful, but I put it on this slide, not just to add some color, but to signal that, yeah, I'm a research psychologist. I've got training in areas like social psychology and evolutionary psychology and personality psychology, as you mentioned. And what I'm going to do tonight is use ideas and research methods and so on from those subfields of psychology to ask questions about religion and trust, which is a little bit of a unique thing still to be studying within psychology. When I got my PhD in 2000, this was a really very unusual thing to be doing, and now maybe slightly less so. And I think part of the reason why it was such a difficult thing to be doing, and maybe still is to some extent, is I think there is some mistrust of religion among scientists. Now, that's not the main topic of my research tonight, but I think it is relevant because some very prominent scientists from different kinds of fields within science have argued that religious people are sort of not to be trusted. Religion is stupid, it's bad. At the very most, at the very best, we could possibly expect religions to help us trust each other and get along with each other only within our own religious groups. So Jews can trust other Jews, but we can't trust members of other religious groups. I'll explain why people have that idea. So in the first part of my talk, I'm going to say, okay, well, maybe the situation is not so grim. Maybe if you boil all religions down, they're essentially the same, and they seem to be a little bit different, but they're not different in important ways. I'm actually going to argue that religions are deeply different from each other, and I'm going to explain how, as a research social psychologist, I've engaged that question with experiments and quantitatively. And I'm going to argue that religions are actually importantly different from each other in important psychological ways. But in the second half of the talk, I'm going to argue that that's actually okay, that religion still promotes trust between people, but in some surprising ways that are not well accounted for by current theories about the ways that religion and other social identities would affect trust between members of different groups. Oh, having trouble advancing the slides. There we go. Okay, so a lot of us here are probably familiar with this new atheist movement, people like Richard Dawkins. I was reading Richard Dawkins' books in graduate school, like The Selfish Gene and The Blind Watchmaker. He's one of the most eminent evolutionary biologists in the world. He seems to think that he also knows something about religion, even though he doesn't seem to have any training in it. And so, maybe a decade ago, he published this book, The God Delusion, in which he says why believing in God is sort of stupid scientifically. God is too implausible to be real from any scientific perspective. Now, Dawkins doesn't say that he's 100% sure that God doesn't exist, but he's quite sure. He's quite sure God doesn't exist. And he also argues that religion is a bad thing. It's bad for our society. It's bad for people to believe in religious things because the God of what he calls the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous, petty, unforgiving, vindictive, misogynistic, ethnic cleanser, homophobic, racist, genocidal, megalomaniacal, malevolent, and so on. And Dawkins's idea is, if you believe in this God, that's not going to have a good effect on how you behave with other people, which is exactly the kind of thing as Professor Samuelson mentioned. This is exactly the sort of thing that social psychologists are interested in and concerned about. So not all scientists are quite that down on religion. People like Joshua Green, Jonathan Haidt, who are both moral psychologists, they allow that religion might not be all bad. It might not make you not get along with everybody and not trust everybody. What it might help you do is trust other people within your religious group, which is not a surprising thing for social psychologists to say. If there is one thing that social psychologists know, it's that we treat members of our own groups much better than we treat members of other groups. We're very in-group oriented. And so Josh Green is a neuroscientist and a social psychologist at Harvard. And he did some very famous studies early on in his career, enough to get him tenure at Harvard, about the neuroscience of moral decision-making. And he would look at brain scans as people wrestled with moral dilemmas and try to figure out whether emotion was more influential or whether reason was more influential. And John Haidt, who actually got his PhD more or less with the same advisor that I did at Penn, Paul Rosen, they both make similar points in these two books. In Moral Tribes, Green argues that our morals are precisely these are things that are designed precisely to help us get along with members of our own groups and suppress our selfishness so we can get along with members of our own groups, but necessarily at the cost, he argues, of making it more difficult to get along with members of other groups, because our morals help us get along with each other, and so they have to come at the cost of making it harder to morally get along with people from other groups. And Haidt makes a similar point in The Righteous Mind. Haidt is most famous in moral psychology for proposing this idea of moral foundations, this idea that liberals and conservatives, or religious people and non-religious people, they rely on different moral intuitions that underlie their religious attitudes, their political attitudes. So liberals, Haidt argues, are most concerned with issues of harm and fairness. Is everybody getting a fair shake? Did you harm an innocent person? Whereas conservatives or religious people are more concerned than liberals are with what Haidt calls the binding moral foundations. These are things that are very sort of patriotic and in-group oriented. These are things that are purity oriented. You're not allowed to do things that are disgusting and impure, even if nobody else is getting hurt. And so Haidt, somewhat like this argument that Josh Green makes, says that it's going to be very hard for religious and non-religious people to get along with each other because their moral intuitions are different, and that almost makes moral debates a non-starter. They almost can't talk to each other because they just don't have the same feelings about what's even morally relevant versus not. Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion is the provocative subtitle of his book. So this raises the question in my mind. Oh, that's not the right slide to be on. Yeah, there we go. This raises the question in my mind, which I took up as early as my dissertation at Penn. Are religions the same or not when it comes to morality? So I was getting my PhD at Penn in psychology shortly after Haidt had finished his PhD at Penn in moral psychology. And so I was almost sort of following in his intellectual footsteps. And I started wondering how different or similar religions are to each other in their moral senses. And what I was trying to do in this series of work I'm about to tell you about was to try to identify an area of morality in which Jews and members of other religions could plausibly be different from each other. So I tried to find an area where do theologies between a religious group differ. I was particularly interested in Jewish morality, having done a bachelor's degree in psychology and Jewish studies. Where is there a place where Jewish theology is different from some other groups' moral theology, like Christian theology? And I wanted to use that as a platform to do experiments on whether or not Jewish and Christian people actually would differ in their moral psychology. Or was it the case that, Christians go to church on Sunday and they hear some sermon about what's moral or not? Jewish people maybe go to synagogue on Friday or Saturday. They hear some sermon about what's moral or not. And that's kind of where their religious morality starts and stops. Maybe it doesn't affect their daily life. Now, the area that I decided to focus on was the moral status of thoughts in these different religions. And the reason why I did that was because I looked at the religious dogma and I thought there was a pretty clear difference between what Christianity says about the morality of thoughts and what Judaism says about the morality of thoughts. So in Christianity, there's this idea, this comes from Jesus giving the Sermon on the Mount. Everyone who looks on a woman to lust for her has committed adultery in his heart. This idea that adultery is something that you can do emotionally or with your mind, not having actually actualized that behavior in any way. And if anybody in this room is somewhat older than me, I was born in 1972, but if you're old enough to remember when President Carter was governor of Georgia and running for president, he gave this interview where he used that language of the New Testament in talking about what it means to lust after somebody and to commit adultery in his heart many times. Now, I always hasten to mention when I show this slide that I think that President Carter gets a bad rap for having said this, because this was a very costly admission for him. And this hurt him politically. And let me tell you, I read the whole interview when I was writing my dissertation about this topic. And then Governor Carter was not so much making a very shameful admission about his lust and his adultery. Instead, what he was doing was talking about the importance of not judging people. And I like to mention that because I so admire him for his sincere religious commitments. And I hate how much he gets, I shouldn't say crucified for having made this quote. But what he was actually saying was, I try not to judge people. And here's why, because as a Christian, I feel like I'm not in a position to judge people. And this is an example he was giving. He says, I might be inclined to judge somebody for committing adultery, but I can't do that because I've looked on a lot of women with lust. I've committed adultery in my heart many times. This is something God recognizes I will do, and God forgives me for it. But what I do like, in terms of putting up this quote from President Carter is this idea that this idea from Christianity about lusting in your heart is something that's familiar to sincere Christians. And this to me opened up the possibility that maybe everyday Christians, even ones that aren't as biblically literate as President Carter is, still might make their psychological judgments in a way that I could demonstrate using empirical research differently from Jewish people. And here's one more piece of evidence that I think this might be possible. This is from the Peanuts. So Charlie Brown, just to skip to the really important part here, Charlie Brown is saying you can't hit a girl. You can't even think about hitting a girl. Thinking about it is just as bad as doing it. And so this idea seems to possibly have permeated people's psychology, possibly Christians or possibly Americans of all kinds. And so that really raised the question for me, would Jewish people who are at least theologically not exposed to this idea, would they think that thinking about doing something is just as bad as doing it? Maybe living in a Christian culture, Jewish people in the United States are no different in terms of their moral judgments than are Christians living in the United States. These are the kinds of questions that were interesting to me in my dissertation. But I thought maybe Jews would be different from Christians in this regard, because in Jewish philosophy, Jewish theology, your thoughts are much less morally important than your behaviors are. Now, like everything in Judaism, and I know I'm speaking to a Jewish studies audience, so I hope you'll agree, like everything, this is not entirely clear. There are millions of different opinions and so on. But I would say, generally speaking, and even across the spectrum of denominations within Judaism, there's much more emphasis on behavior and much less emphasis on your thoughts or your feelings. Let me tell you why I say that. A lot of us in this room are aware there are 613 commandments that traditional Judaism thinks that Jews are obligated to adhere to. The 10 commandments being 10 of those, but, be fruitful and multiply being the first one of those, leaving the corners of your field for the poor being another one of those, and so on. So when I was writing my dissertation, you couldn't Google back then. I don't remember where I looked this up. Maybe this is in the copy of Pirkei Avot I have in my bookcase still. There's a list of the 613 commandments. And I wrote a B next to the ones that were behaviors. Don't murder, don't steal, be fruitful and multiply. And I wrote an M next to the ones that I thought were more mentally oriented, things about your feelings or your beliefs, something like honoring your parents or believing in God. I would write an M. I don't remember the exact numbers because my dissertation was in 2000, but there were somewhere around 590 Bs and only about 20 or so M's. There are many more behavioral commandments in traditional Judaism than there are mental commandments. And I would say even some of the mental commandments that you do see, like honoring your parents, if you look at the Shulchan Aruch, how are you supposed to honor your parents? If you look at the Code of Jewish Law, it doesn't really talk about your feelings. You're supposed to love them and respect them inside. It talks about how you're supposed to behave toward your parents. You're supposed to take them in and take them out and feed them. You're not supposed to sit in your father's place, so as to usurp his authority, and so on. Now, as I said, like everything in Judaism, you could argue with this and you could say, look, maybe there are 20 mental or, commandments, but they're really important. Believing in God is, without belief in God, you could say the whole religion doesn't make sense. Now, is that one commandment? But, how important is that? I will definitely allow that. And I think that's a very interesting question that, that you could debate. I will note that in my understanding, though, even that is something that's a subject of debate within Judaism. Jewish rabbinic tradition is not unanimous on whether there is a commandment to believe in God in the 10 commandments. The first commandment is Anochi Adoshem Elokechem. It's I am the Lord your God. It doesn't say believe that I am the Lord your God. Now, some authorities like the Rambam did say, what does this mean? It means that you should know and believe that, that there's one God. But other rabbinic authorities don't necessarily agree with that. So the Ramban, Nachmanides, said, you can't have a commandment coming from God to believe in God. There's a logical problem there. Because if you don't believe it's God giving you the commandment in the first place, why should you obey it? The commandment's not coming from God. So Nachmanides treated this as more of an assumption than a commandment within Jewish law. So all this is to say, there's a lot more, I think, clarity that Judaism requires you to behave in certain ways, more so than to believe certain things or to have other mental states. And sometimes you're supposed to even act inconsistently with your inclinations in Judaism. So take the commandment not to eat pork. We all know that Jews are not supposed to eat pork. The Talmud takes up the question, what is your attitude supposed to be when it comes to not eating pork? And so the question comes up, well, should you say pork is disgusting and I never wanted to eat it anyway? And the answer is no, presumably because there's no virtue in avoiding eating something that you find disgusting. Rather, the answer seems to be, you're supposed to say to yourself, it says, I want twice. I want to eat pork, but what can I do? My Father in heaven has forbidden it. And the reason why this is a more maybe Jewish attitude or better attitude is this shows that you're doing this out of obedience to God. Who cares how you feel inside, right? What's important is obeying the mitzvah, what is obeying the commandment. And so all this is to say that theologically, it seems to me that there's this difference between Judaism and Christianity. As a psychologist, what I want to know is, can I show in research whether or not Jews and Christians actually have different ideas about this? So this study comes from my dissertation. What I was trying to do was quantitative experiments that ask the question, do Jews and Christians actually have different views about the morality of thoughts? Or, is religion not that important to you psychologically? Pretty much everybody is the same, maybe living in a Christian country. What I think is so striking about really all of the experiments I'm going to describe today is I would get subjects, in this case, they're undergraduates with the same major at the same universities. They're sitting next to each other in, for example, an introduction to psychology class. But I would give them a scenario, and just to give you a little spoiler alert, I'm going to show you that there's actual data that Jews and Christians, even though they're the same age, the same gender breakdown, they're in the same class at the same university in the same city, and so on, that their religions actually affect how they respond to scenarios like this. So in this kind of experiment, I would give people a little scenario. There's some filler in here, which is really not that important. Mr. B went to the University of Pennsylvania. He had thus and such a major. He graduated in thus and such a year. But the key parts of the scenario that I would give the subjects are he's married. He doesn't have any children. One of his colleagues at work is a very attractive woman. She flirts with him, and they both know she'd be willing to have a sexual affair with him. For an average of 20 minutes a day, Mr. B thinks about having an affair with his colleague. That's basically what I tell my subjects. And then I ask them questions like, how does it affect your judgment of his character to know he thinks about having an affair with his colleague? Or do you think he's a bad person? Do you have a gut reaction? I talked about John Haidt's work on morality and gut reactions. So that's why I phrased the question that way. Or even if he doesn't have an affair with his colleague, this is still a bad guy. And I'm not going to focus on the statistics too much tonight, but this statistic here is telling us that there was a statistically significant difference on these questions, such that the Protestants had a lower moral impression of this guy, Mr. B, than my Jewish subjects did. And what I did in the next few slides is a little bit statistically complicated. But what I wanted to do was look at the mediation or the explanatory processes of this effect. So what I said on the previous slide is that Protestants, as compared to Jews, had a worse moral impression of Mr. B. And that's the statistics down here. But what I wanted to know was, why is this happening? If you're a medical doctor and you notice, for example, that people who smoke versus people that don't smoke end up dying earlier, a physician might ask, well, what's the process by which that's happening? Is that happening because of inflammatory processes? Is that happening because you have a buildup of tar in your lungs? What's the variable sort of in the middle, which explains the relationship between these two variables? That's what I was trying to do statistically. And so one thing that I thought could explain why Protestants had a worse moral impression of Jews did is that maybe they think it's worse to actually have an affair. But that turned out not to be the case. And the fact that the mathematical sign of this value here is negative because of the way I coded these variables is actually indicating that, if anything, the Jews gave more substantial ratings to that question than the Protestants did. So it's got little to do with how immoral it is to actually have an affair. but it does seem to do a little bit with how controllable people find those thoughts. Protestants said that Mr. B could control his thoughts to a greater extent than Jewish people did. And the second arrow is saying that those people that said that he could control his thoughts found him more morally responsible for them, not too surprisingly. So that seems to be a plausible mediator of this effect. It seems to be a plausible partial explanation for why the Protestants were more bothered by these thoughts than Jewish people were. But maybe not a great one. And I'll try to explain why without getting too much into the statistics over the next 2 slides or so. But I will say before I get into that Christians, the Protestants actually also thought that Mr. B was more likely to have the affair. It was as if the Jewish people were saying, these are just thoughts, he's not going to do anything. Whereas the Protestants were saying, yeah, he can control these thoughts and he's likely to act on these thoughts, more so than the Jewish people did. Now, but mathematically, the single most impressive evidence that I was able to garner for why the Christians were more bothered by these thoughts than Jewish people were that Christians agreed much more than Jews did. Thinking about an immoral action is just as bad as doing it, just like Charlie Brown was saying a few slides ago. Christians agreed with that much more than Jews did, and the people that agreed with that notion were much more bothered by Mr. B's thoughts than people that weren't. So actually, what seems to be going on here is both Christians and Jews seem to be making these moral judgments very much in line with what their religions say. The Christians are bothered by them, and that seems very related to this idea that they agree thinking about an immoral action is as bad as doing it. Now, Jewish people are also, they're making moral judgments just as their religion says as well. They're not that bothered by Mr. B's thoughts, and they're not agreeing that he's likely to act on them, that he can control those thoughts, and they particularly don't agree that thoughts are as bad as actions. So I published this research in a social and personality psychology journal shortly after completing my dissertation, and that was really a surprising thing to me, because back in those days, you really could not publish articles about religion in general psychology journals. There have always been journals devoted to the psychology of religion, but those have always been seen as kind of minor league journals. And when you would send research on religion to the major journals, I would get back a lot of letters back earlier in my career that said, look, we're a science journal. We don't publish stuff on religion. This doesn't belong here. You should send this to a religion journal. And the fact that this work got into a general psychology journal, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, I think actually, if I can say this, actually did grease the wheels a little bit for social and personality psychology being a little bit more open to the study of religion in the past 20 years. And so what did I do next? I started wondering if my research on religion was actually making it harder for people to get along. If you think back to John Haidt's ideas, Josh Green's ideas, the more I can show that religions are different, the more I might make it hard to get along with each other. And let me tell you why I really started getting worried about that. Because for the next maybe 15 years of my career, I started trying to identify lots and lots of areas where Jewish people were doing something different psychologically than Christian people were. And not only was I making it maybe harder for people of different religious groups to get along, I started thinking, maybe I'm really making it hard for people to get along with the Jews. People talk about Judeo-Christian religions and Judeo-Christian psychology and stuff like that. And I was just driving a wedge between the Judeo and Christian and saying, not so fast. You can't lump all these groups together. Here's another example of a program of research I did on this. When I was in grad school, I overlapped with Dr. Jed Sieve. He's now a professor at Swarthmore College near Philadelphia. And he was really interested in OCD. So Penn, where we both were, their medical school has a world-leading group that studies anxiety and OCD and other anxiety disorders, people like Edna Foa, for example. And so Jed educated me about this idea that OCD doctors talk about thought-action fusion. Thought-action fusion is the idea that your thoughts are just as morally important as your action. And I was like, Jed, wait a minute. That's something that Christians are supposed to believe. And, look at this research I just published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. Christians do believe this more than Jews do. So I just want you to look at the top line of this graph. What did we do? We took a thought-action fusion scale that doctors use when they're working with OCD patients. And this one, thought-action moral, is this idea that thoughts are as bad as actions. So we gave it to Orthodox Jews, conservative Jews, and Reformed Jews, and we gave it to Christians. And then we compared their scores to people without diagnosed anxiety disorders, that's a community sample, and people with diagnosed obsessional disorders. And what did we find? The Jewish people had scores of 9, 10, 12. That's right around what these community living people without anxiety disorders are showing. People with diagnosed OCD-like disorders had a score of 20. Christian undergraduates at the University of Pennsylvania with no diagnosed anxiety disorders had a score of 31, which is way higher than these Jews, way higher than the community sample, and higher even than people with diagnosed OCD. And so what did we say based on this paper? We said two things. One, here's another example where Jews and Christians are different from each other. And two, you've got to be really careful when you're diagnosing somebody with a psychological problem that you're not diagnosing appropriate religious beliefs. These Christians are not showing OCD tendencies, we argued. They're showing religious beliefs that, if you're not careful, could be confused with psychopathology. So we did that. I'm really proud of this paper because I thought that it really gave a nice cautionary tale to practitioners about being careful about learning something about religion and being careful about religion. What else did I do? I worked on forgiveness for a while, as Chava said. So this is a true thing. In the book The Sunflower, some of you may have read it. Simon Wiesenthal describes an SS soldier asking Mr. Wiesenthal for forgiveness for murdering Jews. And I asked people of different religions, what should Wiesenthal have done? And I said, Jewish and Christian theology about forgiveness differ in some key ways. Judaism, we all probably heard this on Yom Kippur. What does Yom Kippur atone for? What does Yom Kippur not atone for? Even God cannot forgive you for an offense, ben adam lechavero, that you do to somebody else until that person has forgiven you. And there's been a process of repentance and reconciliation. When I give people this scenario, Jewish people say, this is nuts. A Jew can't forgive, some generic Jew that was not the actual victim can't forgive this SS soldier for something that he did to other people. Whereas Christians say, yes, Jesus forgave everyone and you should forgive everyone too. And I followed this up by looking at offenses that didn't happen to Jewish people, but happened to other groups like Black Christians. I would ask, this is another study I'm particularly proud of. I asked Jewish people and Black Christians, African-American Christians, how forgivable they think slavery-related offenses were. And even though this was the group, Black Christians, that slavery happened to, they were more forgiving for those offenses than Jewish people were. So that's another example where I said, look, forgiveness, Jews and Christians really are different from each other. And again, I was able to publish this in a general psychology journal, which made me happy. And last, I fixed that slide and it's upside down again. I don't know why that keeps happening. PowerPoint keeps flipping this graph over, and I fixed it when I was making these slides, and it seems to have unfixed itself. Let me try again. Okay, it worked this time. I think it's every time I save it, it inverts that graph, oddly. I also looked at religiosity. What does it mean to be a religious person? Is religion more about your beliefs or about your practices? And what I showed is that Jewish people say that practice is more important than belief. But Christians will say belief is more important than practice. So again, I wrote a paper, again, publishing this in a general psychology journal, European Journal of Social Psychology, saying, look, Jews and Christians are different from each other. So as I mentioned a few slides ago, I really started making this argument, that there are different forms of culture in psychology, and religion is an important form of culture that affects how people make moral judgments, whether they're forgiving, their OCD-like tendencies, what it means to be a religious person. And I said, psychologists have really got to start paying more attention to religion. It has profound influences on the kinds of things psychology is interested in. But the key thing that I argued in both of these papers was, look how different Jews are psychologically from other groups. And then I thought, oh no, am I making it hard to get along with people? Because when I go on Facebook, I see all these memes all the time that, Republicans are fighting with Democrats. And look, deep down, we're all the same. White people, black people, gay people, straight people, Catholics, atheists, we all have the same skeleton. So we're all deep down the same. We should all get along with each other. And I see memes like this: we're all the same animal, therefore racism is stupid. There's black dogs and blonde dogs and brown dogs and another black dog, but deep down we're all dogs, so it's okay. And finally, here's one that you could do with your elementary school student. We are exactly the same on the inside. You give your kids brown eggs and white eggs, and they have to record observations. And what do they say? Well, they say, look, there's brown eggs, they're different from white eggs. But then they crack the eggs open and they get a look at diversity of the importance of what's on the inside. It's like, thank God the brown eggs and the white eggs are the same inside. Well, I've just been arguing for the past 15 years based on verifiable, statistically significant, quantitative experiments that Jews and Christians are actually different from each other. So is that making it harder for us to get along across groups? So I started turning to research on trust and religion. And I was able to secure a grant from, of all places, the Air Force Office of Scientific Research on Religion and Culture and Trust. And the idea is, you might think the Air Force, when they fund research, they're funding research on how to make missiles more accurate and pilots have faster reaction times. They do fund all that stuff. But they also fund research on topics like trust. Because if you have a Muslim pilot and a Jewish navigator and a Christian bombardier, are those people going to be able to work together and accomplish their mission? So we wrote a grant saying we think religion might affect trust because of 3 different things about religion. And I'll go through those briefly in the next couple slides. In-group and out-group identities, beliefs in a scary, monitoring, punishing God, and something I'll call costly signaling, which I'll get to in just a slide or two. And I want to note that even though that Air Force grant is over, with a very multidisciplinary team here at ASU and at the University of Nevada, Reno, we've been able to continue our research on religion and other cultural identities with a grant from the Army Research Institute. We're asking questions about what cultures are important to individuals, including religion. What do people see as important and defining about those cultures, things like moral judgment? And how much do those things relate to adjustment in stressful environments? Now, this Army grant is actually winding down. It ends in November 30th of this year. So I'm actually becoming a little bit pessimistic and worried about my ability to continue funding my students and my research on these topics. But what have we found so far? Well, the first thing we looked at is religious in-groups and out-groups and trust. And this is very much harkening back to John Haidt and Josh Green, and that thing that, if social psychologists know one thing, it's that it's easier to get along with people from your group and harder to get along with people from other groups. And I've just spent slides showing you that religions really are different from each other psychologically. So we argued religion is not just any in-group or out-group identity, it's a powerful identity. And so we made the hypothesis that if you have people interacting with each other from different religious groups, they're going to find it hard to trust each other. We did have a little nuance to this prediction, which I'm not going to get into tonight, but there's been a very interesting stream of research championed by Will Gervais, who I think he's just moved from the University of Kentucky to Brunel University in London. I think he's in London now. But this idea that people find atheists very untrustworthy. And so we thought maybe atheists might even distrust other atheists, but that would be the one exception to your religious identity. Well, I guess you could say, or lack thereof, making it easier to trust other people. So that was a prediction we made. We made predictions about whether people's belief in God would make people trust them more. So Aaron Oren Zion, Azim Sharif at University of British Columbia, Joe Henrich now at Harvard, they have this very influential idea about the evolution of societies and religious beliefs, which is big gods theory. And this goes by slightly different name, big gods, supernatural punishment hypothesis. But the idea is that if you believe in a punishing God, this makes you less likely to misbehave because you're afraid God is going to punish you. But belief in God's forgiveness, Sharif and Noren Zion have actually shown in some very clever experiments that actually makes you more likely to cheat and misbehave. So in Christianity, I understand there's this idea of cheap grace. You're not supposed to, just sin with the hopes that God's going to forgive you. But to some extent, Christian people do seem to behave a little bit that way under some circumstances. And finally, we made predictions about costly signaling and trust. Costly signals are things that people do to signal commitment to their in-groups. And this idea has been applied. This idea originally came from evolutionary biology, but it's actually made its way into the social science of religion. So the idea is religion often involves costly signals. These can be things like giving charity, making sacrifices, if you're Muslim, wearing a hijab, circumcising your children. These are things that are costly things to do to varying extents that, among other things, might signal to other members of your group that you're a trustworthy person. And so we made the hypothesis that if you see a member of your own group engaging in a costly signal, you're going to trust that person more. But when you see an out-group member engaging in costly signaling, you're going to trust them less because those people are demonstrating to you that they're committed to their own religious group. And I never really appreciated how costly some of these signals can be. But this is my son on his 8th day of life, shortly after his Brit Milah, after he was circumcised. And you don't know this, but this is actually not his mother holding him. I can tell because of the Apple Watch and the painted nails, neither of which my wife actually has or had. This is actually our friend Farida holding our son after he was circumcised. Farida is a practicing Muslim who wears a hijab. She's signaling commitment to her own religion. How am I possibly letting her hold my baby son shortly after he underwent this traumatic surgery? It's kind of a puzzle, I think, psychologically. But as you're going to see on the next couple of slides, I'm going to argue that actually religion is something that helps us trust each other. So this is just a very prototypical way that I did these studies that I want to show you. This is, and I'm going to give you some results that, from just a couple of studies that really generalize across, I would say a dozen or 15 studies that we did under the auspices of this Air Force grant that I mentioned. We would give people something that looks like a Facebook profile, and some of the things were always the same in these profiles. There were actually 8 versions of it, but people always saw this sort of nice looking guy, Ali. He's always a biology major. He always likes pizza, hamburgers, and tacos and not ice cream. Now that's a little weird. I actually did that on purpose. I wanted people to be able to say that they trusted or didn't trust Ali. And I wanted to give them a little bit of license to say, well, I don't trust the guy because he doesn't like ice cream. That's weird. Even though all of the subjects saw him not like ice cream. What the different subjects did see was different information about Ali's religious beliefs and practices. These were all ASU Christian undergraduate subjects. Half of them saw Ali identify himself as a Muslim, and half of the subjects saw him identify himself as a Christian. Half of them saw him believe in, Henrik and Noren Zion and Sharif's punishing God. Half of subjects saw him believe in a forgiving God. And half of subjects saw him do versus do not donate money regularly to charities associated with his religion. So these were the things that we manipulated: his religious group, his beliefs about God, and his costly signaling, the charitable behavior. And then we asked how trustworthy people saw him. Do you think he's trustworthy? Would you trust him with a secret? Would you lend him money? Do you think he has integrity? Questions like that. To our great surprise, our first finding in this study, and I'm asking you, I guess, to trust me, this is true across actually about a dozen studies, whether the subject identified himself as Muslim versus Christian had no effect, no statistically significant effect on how trustworthy the subjects found him. Whether he said he believed in a forgiving versus punishing God had no effect on how trustworthy the subjects found him. This 0 is about as low as you can get, and this 0.95 is about as non-statistically significant as you can get. What did affect whether people said they trusted this guy Ali or not was whether he said he gave to charity. If he gave to charity, he was more trusted, that is, if he costly signaled, than if he didn't give to charity. Now, but you'll remember that wasn't exactly our hypothesis. Our hypothesis was that if he was Christian and gave to charity, he would be more trusted, whereas if he was Muslim and gave to charity, he would be less trusted by my Christian subjects. And that's not what we found. We found that regardless of whether he was Christian or Muslim, the same thing happened. He was more trusted if he gave to charity and less trusted if he didn't give to charity. So we did what good social psychologists do. We followed up our research with a further study thinking, okay, maybe they didn't really notice if he was Muslim or not. So we made it a little bit more obvious. Now we used female protagonists, and we made it a little bit more obvious that, this nice looking friendly individual is Muslim, but this one is, less obviously Muslim. So this was the Christian, this was the Muslim. In a further experiment, we found exactly the same thing. People that give to charity are more trusted, regardless of whether that's a Muslim charity or a Christian charity, as viewed by these Christian subjects in this experiment. So we wanted to do one more study. And we thought, well, look, these are nice looking, attractive people we're using in these studies. Maybe people see that attractive face and, they look kind of friendly, and that's all that matters. So we did a third study where we had no pictures. And instead of looking at charitable behavior, which you could think, well, that's a very trustworthy thing to do, he gives to charity, we looked at a different form of costly signaling, which was food restrictions. Things like keeping kosher or observing halal rules, or if you're Catholic, not eating meat on Lent. And so again, we had Christian subjects, and we said, imagine this guy, Sam or Samir, he goes to a dinner event at a steakhouse and he shouldn't really eat anything because the food is not halal and he's Muslim. Or it's Lent and he's Catholic and he really shouldn't eat any meat. And then we told our different subjects, some of them heard that this guy ate the meat anyway, or they heard that even though he was very hungry, he didn't eat anything, or there's no information about what he eats. And what did we find? The same thing. If he engages in costly signaling, which in this case was avoiding eating food that he wasn't religiously supposed to eat, he's most trustworthy. This is true regardless of whether he's Catholic or Muslim. And he's less trusted if he does eat something he's not supposed to eat, which on this slide is labeled engages in anti-costly signaling. I'm going to skip this very statistical and complicated slide and just say, based on our review of this literature, costly signaling theory of religion, which is all about religion and trust, is in somewhat good shape. It explains some of our findings, but it's in a little bit need of reformation. That's, for the Jews in the audience who may not know, this is a picture of Martin Luther nailing his Protestant theses to the church door or whatever. But what is surprising is the outgroup effects. Costly signals are not supposed to make you trust members of religious outgroups. So again, you remember I talked about mediation and process and mechanisms a few slides ago. We wanted to know, how can this be? What is costly signaling leading to that's making you trust somebody more, even if they're a different religion from you? So we did one final study I'll tell you about. We again took advantage of the fact that college students love Facebook. And we said, you're thinking about hiring a painter for your house. Now we chose that because, a painter is somebody who's going to have access to your house. They can steal things from you. They could copy your key and so on. And so you need a trustworthy painter. And so we said, look at this guy's Facebook profile. This is somebody who you might hire to paint your house. And again, this was somebody with our Christian subjects. We painted, so to speak, as Christian versus Muslim. And we said, look at his status. I've got the best boss. He took us out for lunch at a Korean barbecue place. I couldn't eat anything since the food wasn't halal, but wasn't that nice of him? And that's the only thing that differed on this slide. Sometimes he ate the food and sometimes he didn't eat the food, like in that prior study with Sam or Samir. And then we asked, what does him adhering to his religion or doing this costly signaling mean to people that ultimately translates into their trust? This is a very complicated statistical diagram, but what I want you to focus on is integrity. What we found statistical evidence for, you see how these 80% numbers are much bigger than these other numbers inside these boxes. When somebody costly signals, even if they're from a different religion than you find them to be higher in integrity. You say, okay, this guy is sticking to what he says his beliefs are. And that is what strongly translates into more trust, more so than certain other things, like whether you perceive this person to be a benevolent person. So these costly signals, whether they're from your religion or from another religion, translate into more integrity, which translates into more trust. So last slide. What I've argued in this talk is that religious groups really are different from each other psychologically, and we can actually look at that and produce evidence for that using social scientific methods. I think we can have the really hopeful message that we trust each other despite our religious differences, and that religious people should not be afraid to act religious in public for fear that people are going to mistrust us because we belong to a different religion. My data actually show the converse, that the more somebody displays commitment to their own religion, the more people trust them. And why do I think that's such an important point to end on? This is a true story. I was on a plane about 5 years ago. This is well after 9/11, obviously. And I'm sitting in the middle seat, and this middle-aged woman pulls out a book. I happen to notice that it's a Jewish prayer book. And she starts to recite Tfilat HaDerech, the prayer for travelers. Now, this is a prayer that I know by heart because I recite it myself every time I get on a plane. Okay, I know this thing by heart. She finishes benching Tfilat HaDerech, and she turns to me. She obviously doesn't know I'm Jewish, because she says to me, "Don't worry, that wasn't Arabic." And I spent the rest of the flight thinking, what should I have said to this woman? Should I have told her, lady, I knew what you were saying, and I knew that was Tfilat HaDerech. Should I embarrass her for saying such a shameful thing, about another religious group? Or should I have said to her, look, lady, I don't care if you're praying in Arabic. That would make me trust you more. And, to this day, I kind of regret, I didn't say anything to her. She was older than me. I didn't feel I could be very disrespectful to her. But this experience really stuck in my mind, because what must it be like for Muslim Americans after 9/11 that might be afraid to get on a plane because people are gonna worry that they're terrorists? Well, I think my research gives the very hopeful message to Christian people and Jewish people and Muslim people that religion is actually something that can promote trust between members of our society. So I will end there, and thank you very much, and turn to discussion and Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you, Adam. This was terrific. By way
Should I
of,
leave the slides, or should I?
I guess we don't need the slides at this
I'll
point,
stop, and then we
but
can
have
focus on
access. Yeah, you can have
discussion.
access to it in case you want to go to a particular slide.
Perfect.
So by way of starting our conversation, what would you say are the major challenges to your research? Whether kind of technically, how do you put together the research, or attitudinally, or however you want to, look at it?
That's a great question. I'm thinking about three things, and I hope I remember them all. One of them is, I spend a lot of my career looking at Jewish-Christian differences because I'm most familiar with Judaism. And, Christianity offers a contrast that living in a Christian society, I can say, oh, I think Christians think this, but I think Jews think that. I would really love to be able to extend my research to many other groups, Hindus and Muslims and Buddhists and so on. But I I need knowledgeable collaborators. I don't, sometimes people will say to me, look, why don't you just go to India and just give out your surveys? And I always say to them, look, I don't know enough about India. I can't just go there and start asking questions. And I'll give you a great example of why I say that. Let me just write down the other two things before I forget, because I'm going to ramble a little bit. One is I've collaborated a bit in my career with Steve Bokenkamp, who, like you, is a Regents professor. He's in Chinese. He's one of the world's experts on Taoism.
Yeah, we were together in Indiana, so we know each other well.
Wow, okay, I don't think I knew that. He's the world's expert on Taoism.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a conversation with him about religion in China. Well, why don't I just go to China and start doing religion? In the Pew survey, people will claim based on the Pew survey that, China is all non-religious people. Nobody's religious in China.
No,
but you go to Buddhist temples and you go to graveyards and people are praying, they're doing ancestor worship, they go to Taoist temples, they meditate. Steve asked me, what are they doing? Well, here's why people think that no one is religious in China, because the Pew survey goes to China and the question they ask them about religion is, what religion do you believe in or identify with? Well, that is a very Western individualistic Christian way of thinking about this. Even you ask Jewish people, what religion do you believe in? Somebody could say, well, do I really have to believe to be Jewish? You could have a 3-hour-long theological debate, right? So that's one challenge I face, is I really want to do this in a broader perspective, but I don't feel like I myself have the background. I always need collaborators. The second thing is funding. I mean, I have been really fortunate in my career to get funding from Templeton and even the Department of Defense. The National Science Foundation supported that with a small grant, that research I mentioned, comparing Jewish forgiveness for the Holocaust and Black Christian forgiveness for slavery. That, frankly, I think was the best idea I ever had in my entire career about research. And I was not able to translate that into sort of a full-fledged grant. I think because of the third thing that I was going to mention. So besides funding is, I think I could say hostility. I think that was very much true earlier in my career. I think it's still somewhat true, but there's certainly sort of a cold climate in psychology and the sciences in general when it comes to religion. I think there's still that attitude that, real scientists don't study religion. Religion is not an appropriate topic for scientists. You can't study religion using scientific methods, because how can you measure whether God is real? Well, look, I'm not trying to do that. How can you measure people's religious beliefs? I say, well, you can give them a survey or you can interview them. You can even do brain scans like Dr. Newberg at UPenn did, the neurologist or radiologist. I'm not sure what his specialty is, but he did a very famous study 20 or 25 years ago where he had people in medical brain scanners and seeing what was happening in their brain. You can do these things, but I think that the climate has been a real challenge over the course of my career.
Yeah. Okay, great. Lisa, do we have questions from the audience that we can relate
We
to?
do. There's one. There's a question in the Q&A. Can you see that, Adam?
Yes, about generational differences. I would really, generational differences. Okay, no, it goes on. And movements and anti-Semitism. And
go ahead and read
there's a
it.
lot in there. Generations.
Go ahead and read the question before you answer it.
Oh, not everyone can see that. Okay.
I don't think so.
I see. Okay, I'm just learning how these panels work. Okay. So anonymous attendee asks, are these statistics consistent across generations, i.e. boomers versus college students? I am not a developmental psychologist. I have not done very much in my career about generational differences like this. I really think it's a fascinating question for a number of reasons. One of which is, you'd probably think that older people were brought up in a more traditional version of their religion. And nowadays, there's so much more multiculturalism and exposure to other religious groups, and people are, college students today like to identify as spiritual but not religious. There's been a lot of ink spilled in the psychology of religion about just what that means. And I think it turns out it means different things to different people. Somebody might say they're spiritual because they love nature. They feel really connected to the universe. Certain flavors of Christians say they're spiritual but not religious because it's so much about their faith and identity. It's not about acting religious so as to impress other people. That's been a very hard thing to nail down, actually. So when it comes to generational differences, I think that's a really fascinating question. I don't have a great answer to that, at least not based on my own research. And similarly, you ask about different movements and denominations, also between generations. Just to focus on the movements part, I think that's a super interesting question as well. So think about Orthodox versus maybe other denominations of Jews in the US, or maybe think about American Jews versus, let's say, Israeli Jews. These are studies I haven't done, but I think that theoretically, you could make very different predictions about how those groups might look. So for example, American Jews live, and maybe more secular Jews, more so than Orthodox Jews, you know, they live in a Christian culture. And so what do you do psychologically when you live in a culture that is different from your religious identity? And some people would even say, you know, we're living in exile. This is a hostile overall culture that we're living in, right? One thing that could happen is that your psychology could be influenced by that majority culture. And maybe American Jews, maybe particularly if they're more Reformed, conservative, maybe a little less so if they're Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox, you know, American Jews might look a little bit Christian in their psychology because they're surrounded by it and they have friends that are Christian and so on. I think a different possibility is that Jewish people could try to distance themselves from the overall culture, and maybe they look sort of super Jewish. And maybe if I looked at more Orthodox Jews, maybe even in the US, or if I looked at Israeli Jews, maybe they look a little bit more like what I've been portraying as Christian, because they don't spend all day thinking like, I have to separate myself from the Christians. You know, Judaism is so much about separateness, and, you know, all these commandments in the Tanakh are, you know, don't act like the other groups act, you know, be a separate people, be holy, and so on. And so this is something that I think actually is really begging for further research. I think it's a great question. And then the question goes on, how does discrimination and anti-Semitism impact levels of trust? Is there a difference in generations between that? You know, I think about that a lot as well. Just when I was starting, I think, to do this research on trust and religion, and I got this Air Force grant, and this grant was active, and I was doing all these studies. Among many other acts of anti-Semitism that were happening in the US at that time, the cemetery where my father's parents are buried in Philadelphia, Aleichem Shalom, was vandalized. And there were graves that were kicked over and swastikas. This was in the cemetery with my father's parents. And so anti-Semitism was very much on my mind and was kind of flavoring, I think, my approach to this research. And my concern that, you know, if I've been showing in my research for decades now that religion really does shape you psychologically, and Jewish psychology really is different when it comes to identity and morality and forgiveness and all these things, that this is going to make things worse. But my research actually made me end up feeling a lot tentatively. I mean, this is just some social psychology studies, right? I don't know that there's, you know, too much real world impact of what I've been able to show in the lab, but it made me a little bit less worried that that everyday people are going to exhibit anti-Semitism and mistrust people merely because they're Jewish or religious. And instead, what I tried to remind myself is that these acts of anti-Semitism and other religious violence, you know, anti-Muslim behaviors, all of the anti-Asian prejudice we've seen, partly because of COVID and some of the dialogues in our society about COVID, all these things are thankfully pretty rare. And they're probably committed by not mainstream people. They're committed by extremists that, you know, it's terrible. It deserves a lot of attention and intervention, but this is not regular people. I think you should not be afraid to sit next to somebody on a plane wearing a yarmulke or saying a Jewish prayer or wearing a hijab or praying in Arabic or something like that, that most people are actually going to trust you just fine because of that.
Mm-hmm. So you have a third question, I believe.
a third and fourth.
Oh, fourth. Okay, go.
I can deal with the Steve Goldston one. Did I grow up in Philadelphia? Yes. What class did I go to at Central? I actually went to Akiba Hebrew Academy. So I didn't go to Central. My mother went to Northeast. My mother and father, Oliver Sholem, went to Northeast High School. And this is a little bit of a tangent. I apologize. Just a few months ago, I was visiting my mother, and she had me cleaning out her house. And two things I found, which I framed and put in my office, are my bubby's high school diploma. I'm looking at it right now. South Philadelphia High School for Girls, 1933. I was able to frame that and rescue that from my mother's basement. If I can kvel a little bit about my bubby, Zichrona Livracha, she graduated first in her class at 16 and was granted a full scholarship to Bryn Mawr College, which is a great liberal arts college. She couldn't go. It was the Depression. She couldn't go. And then I also have, this is something I didn't know she did, because her father died when she was 9. So there were 7 brothers and sisters, my great aunts and uncles and her. I have her diploma from the Hebrew Sunday School Society of Philadelphia, Frida Gerson, dated 1932. And I just brought those back from my mother's house in Philadelphia. Is there a difference between Jews and Christians besides religion and religious beliefs? Robert Olesh. I would love to hear, are you able to talk on a meeting like this, or can you type more? I'd love to hear more what you have in mind. When I've looked at things like morality and forgiveness and things like that, I've sort of seen those as maybe religious beliefs, maybe these are things that are sort of more general psychological things, but are at least informed by religion. But I'd love to hear what you're thinking about.
I just gave Robert the ability to speak, so he can go ahead and do that.
I see him.
Okay.
You look like you need a shave.
Okay. Oh, that's my dog.
That's your dog.
Okay. Is there a difference in how Jews and non-Jews communicate and act emotionally and psychologically?
I think the best example I have of that is the slide where I was talking about OCD and thought action fusion. This is not thought of as having to do with religion at all. This is just a clinical scale that you might use to assess whether somebody has OCD-like tendencies. And there are really stark religious differences in that. I think the forgiveness stuff, you could call that a religious belief, and the morality stuff, I think you could call that a religious belief. But is the OCD stuff kind of what you were driving at all, or something else?
Well, no.
Okay.
Even if you're not religious, the thought of tikkun olam, helping the world, is I suppose is ingrained in Jewish people.
I think that would be a super fascinating thing to look at. So within the sciences, there's this field, it's a very multidisciplinary field about sustainability. How can we get people to recycle, and how can we get people to, drive electric cars and, cut their shower time and cut their greenhouse gas emissions and stuff like that. There is a little bit of research in sustainability about religion. I would say not a lot. And the general finding is that religious people tend to be less green. And why is that? Maybe they think that God's going to fix everything. Maybe if Jesus comes again, I guess a Jew could think this too, if the Messiah was going to come, that everything will be okay. This will sort of magically fix itself. I really share your intuition that Jewish people have such a strong emphasis on tikkun olam that it should go the other way for Jewish people. That if you're Jewish and whether you're religious or not, you've had this idea ingrained from the time you were born that we have a responsibility to repair the world and take care of the planet. And I'm not aware of anybody who's looked at that.
Well, actually, this is very interesting because I'm writing a book on Jewish environmental spirituality. And right now, this very week, I started the last chapter of the book, which is on Tikkun Olam, science, science, environment, and social justice. Basically, those are the issues that I'm trying to figure out in this chapter. It's all in the, so I'm whoever is doing the research that you refer to definitely does not take into consideration the huge impact of religion on this, on environmentalism. So I have no idea why you said what you said concerning environmentalism, because religious environmentalism is thriving right now.
Okay,
a lot of people are behaving sustainably because of religion.
I think that it's not as big of a topic in sort of the social science of sustainability, and maybe it's a much bigger thing in the human. I can only think of one name off the top of my head of somebody that uses kind of the same methods and ideas and research designs and stuff that I do. Elizabeth Minton at the University of Wyoming, I think, is maybe the only name that leaps to mind about somebody that's studying this from a more social science perspective. It's great to know there's a lot going on in other fields like the humanities. And I really wonder whether people have taken kind of a theologically, historically, religious studies, sophisticated dive into all of that, or if it's more just like, let me give out a survey. I ask someone how religious they are. I ask them if they recycle. I don't actually go to their house and weigh their recycling bin, right, to get a very hard measure of whether they recycle or not. I don't look at their water bill. I think it's probably somewhat rudimentary research.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. That's something to think about. So Lisa, tell us if we can thank the audience right now. And I would like to say one word about the coming activities of Jewish studies. Is that okay?
There's a funny joke in the chat.
You want to do the joke?
No. I can read it because somebody put it in anonymously. Is it a joke or a truism? Are there real differences? A priest, a minister, and a rabbi trek across the desert. They come to an inn. They're all expressing how thirsty they are. The priest says, "I'm so thirsty, I must have some wine." The minister says, "I'm so thirsty, I must have a beer." The rabbi says, "I'm so thirsty, I must have diabetes." Actually really good.
Okay. So religion is also a cause for some laughter. That's good. So I'm going to thank all of you for attending the first of our conversations this year. Let me remind you that next week is the second lecture in this series and the lecture will focus on religion's role in human evolution. So that's going to be delivered by Paul Cassell, another ASU professor. And then on October 14th, we are going to have a lecture on a topic that we wrestled with last year. So this is on campus anti-Semitism, where, when, and why Jews are targeted. And we are going to host a professor from another university, that's Eyal Feinberg for Texas A&M. He's going to be our guest speaker. And on October 17th, we have the rather large conference on Jewish-Muslim relations through the ages. So actually all of those issues in the month of October kind of relate to each other. So I'm very, very glad that Professor Cohen brought the issue of trust among religious traditions. That's definitely going to be necessary for us as we enter the reflection on the relationship between Jews and Muslims. So thank you very much to Professor Cohen and to all the people who joined us in this webinar. And have a good evening, and hopefully we'll see you next week.